Today we're going to be talking about one of the systems in the human body. And the system we're going to be talking about today is the respiratory system. The respiratory system, like every system in our body, is absolutely essential to the function and well-being of us. And without it, we wouldn't be able to survive. If you can't breathe on your own, then you actually, in order to stay alive, you have to have a respirator. You have to have on some type of, something breathing for you. So like I said, there's no way around it. It can't take any days off. It doesn't really get an opportunity to take any, time off. It's got to be functioning all of the time in order to supply our body with oxygen. Because as we've talked about, you have to have oxygen inside those cells to basically have energy. And without oxygen, we don't have energy. So, we've got to be breathing. We breathe all the time. And the great part about it is we breathe even when we're not thinking about it, right? We can breathe literally while we are unconscious, right? We breathe in our sleep. Some of us may snore in our sleep, but it doesn't matter how we breathe. We've got to be breathing all the time. So when we increase our level of activity, we breathe more. We've talked about that, where the demand for more energy requires more oxygen. So our respiratory system has to be functioning at a high level, which means we have to have a good set of lungs, right? We have to have lungs that are functioning. So anytime we do anything, if we have a damaged lung or if we do something to damage that lung, that's going to affect our ability to breathe, and therefore that's going to affect our ability to determine how active we are, right? So if we do something, for example, smoking, and smoking does a lot of damage to your lungs, it can really limit your ability to be active, because that damage that's done to your lungs, it reduces the amount of capacity that your lungs have, and it makes a lot of physical activities and things like that much more difficult. And we may not think about that, but in terms of a lifetime of putting harmful things into your lungs and damaging them, it can really limit your ability to be active and to be mobile and do all those different types of things. So let's kind of take a look inside the respiratory system. Now we kind of know what it does. Let's take a look at some of the structures inside this respiratory system and look and see what roles they play. So we can divide the respiratory system essentially into two halves. We have an upper respiratory system and a lower respiratory system. So we're going to start by looking at the upper respiratory system. The upper respiratory system includes the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, and the trachea. So it's basically everything from about here up. Right? Well, I say should here and up. Okay. So obviously we know what our nose is. Okay, the nose is on in front of our face, and we use it a lot for smelling, but we also use it a lot for breathing. Okay. A lot of times, we tell people if you're really trying to focus on your breathing, you breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. Okay. When you're breathing through your nose, that's the kind of the preferred way of breathing. One, because there's a lot of hairs and mucus and things like that in our nose, and that helps filter the air. And two, you don't want to really be breathing through your mouth because it's kind of loud and somewhat obnoxious. So we try to breathe through our nose regularly. But I said, when you're telling someone to breathe through the nose, out through their mouth, a lot of times that can help them slow down their breath because it's the body's preferred way of breathing. So, we get going really fast, and when we're playing an activity, everyone's just like, because they think, by opening their mouth, they're going to get more air. But really, if you can still continue to breathe through your nose and out through your mouth, like I said, you're kind of getting back to the way the body prefers to do it, and it kind of helps calm people down and kind of get that breathing under control so that they don't go into hyperventilation, which is where they're ventilating above or beyond the normal ventilation, and then you have a problem there. So we're all familiar with the nose. The pharynx basically goes from your nose, the nasal cavity, into your mouth. It's kind of that little cavity there between your nose and your mouth. So food and air can enter the pharynx. Okay, and that's really the only one where we're going to have food going into. The larynx sits at the back of the pharynx. Okay. The larynx a lot of times is called our voice box or our vocal box. And that's because the larynx contains the vocal cords, and as air passes through that, it's going to create sound. So my voice that you're hearing right now, that is because of the air that is going over those vocal cords, and it is creating the sound that's coming to you. So, if we're yelling, or if we're screaming, or if we're singing, or whatever it is we're doing, even if we're just talking, that vibration goes over those vocal cords and creates the sounds that we hear. And so, like I said, air comes in through our nose. We can bring it in through our mouth. Food can come in through our pharynx, but once it hits the larynx, it's air only. In the upper respiratory system, we have a bunch of cilia, which are tiny little hairs, and then we also have mucus. So, we know we have mucus in our nose, and we also have hairs in our nose, and we also have those, though, in our pharynx, and moving back, they get kind of smaller. When we bring in air, we warm up the air. Okay, so we warm up the air, and that kind of spreads the air out. And we also use this mucus and cilia to filter the air. So things that we don't want in our lungs, in our lower respiratory system, we try to filter out as much of that as we can with this cilia and with this mucus. So we trap particles in our nose. We trap particles in this mucus, in this cilia, and they exit through our nose. So if you've ever found yourself in a really, maybe a really old building, and maybe it's, something like that, and you've spent any amount of time in there, you come out and you may blow your nose, and you may see that, whatever you blow your nose into is very dark brown or perhaps even black. Because if they're in a very old building, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of moving around in the air, and that stuff gets trapped in your nose, and you definitely don't want to breathe that in. So other things that we can trap, it's just particles. Obviously, we're not trying to inhale very large things because they're not going to be floating around. But things like smoke, those cilia can trap smoke, pollen that's in the air. Okay, so for those of you that may have allergies, this is one of the reasons why pollen, when pollen's up and pollen counts are high, we have problems with it because that pollen's going to get stuck in our nose. And if you have an allergy to pollen, now you have something that's an allergen, and it's right there in your nose. So your nose is going to start to get runny, your eyes are going to start to water, and you're really going to be battling that. And your body's doing its best to make sure that it doesn't get in, but there's still going to be some of it that slips through the defenses, and there's also going to be a lot of it that's stuck right there in your nose. So you're constantly blowing your nose, because it's running, and trying to get all that stuff cleaned out as best you can. And so the trachea is our windpipe. And this is the pipe that's right here. It's where the larynx connects, and this is going to take the air down. And you can kind of tell when I'm pushing here, you can that effect it's going to have on the larynx, which is affecting my vocal cords, and then the air as it's moving down that tube. As the air moves down the trachea, it's going to enter one of two bronchi, and the bronchi are going to branch off, and one's going to go to one lung and the other one's go to another lung. And then once in there, we're going to go through some smaller tubes, which are called bronchioles. And at the end of these bronchioles, we're going to find something called alveoli. And alveoli are small little air sacs. And in these air sacs, we're going to find a moist environment. And what that's going to allow is that the gases that have been pulled in, so in this case oxygen, to dissolve in the air. And so they're dissolved now. And so since they're dissolved, we've talked a lot about before about how most materials, in order to pass through membranes and things like that, they have to be dissolved. So we dissolve this gas, and that way they can move into the capillaries that surround these alveoli, and the gas goes right into the bloodstream. So now we have the oxygen where we need it, in our bloodstream, okay? Because now it can be picked up in our bloodstream, it's going to go to our heart and be pumped all around the body, providing the body with the much needed oxygen that it's going to need to carry out all of those activities that it does. And really not a part of our respiratory system, but our rib cage is definitely involved. When we breathe in a deep breath, our rib cage expands. Our rib cage is actually attached to our lungs, so when we expand our lungs and our diaphragm helps move that so that we can expand and contract our rib cage, which is another reason why if you've ever had a damaged rib or a bruised rib, it's incredibly painful to take a deep breath, and it's really really painful if anyone ever tells a joke and you need to laugh. You're really going to feel that rib cage moving if you've ever had those bruised ribs. So that pretty much wraps up our respiratory system. We've got our upper respiratory system and all of its component parts and the lower respiratory system, and together they're working to provide oxygen to the entire body.